At King's Norton, the Queen would have stayed at this house, this building here, which is actually where the King's Norton History Society hold their meetings. It was originally the Royal Bailiff's house, and the troops camped down by the River Ray. Now, Thomas Hall, who was the vicar of King's Norton, was an ardent Puritan. And when the Royalist troops arrived, they knew this, and they fetched him out of the vicarage and roughed him up considerably. And they removed lead from the church roof to supplement their stores of bullets. From King's Norton, the Queen made for Stratford-upon-Avon, where Prince Rupert met her, and then he escorted her for her rendezvous with the King at Oxford. The harsh treatments Birmingham had received at the hands of the Royalists led to the parliamentarians setting up their own regiment of horse in the area, led by Colonel John Fox. Now, he was given the nickname of the Jovial Tinker, but that was an ironic name, as he was a man of very dour countenance. His father was reputed to be in the metal trade in either Walsall or Tamworth, and hence the derogatory tinker. In October of 1643, Colonel Fox turned out the well-off Catholic Middlemore family from their home at Edgbaston Hall and turned it into a military garrison for 200 men. They used Edgbaston Church for stabling. They took the lead from the church roof to melt down the bullets and roof timbers and stones to build barricades. Colonel Fox's regiment went out on raiding parties to attack and plunder the Royalist houses in the locality. They also scouted for the local parliamentarian leader, who was the new Lord Denbigh, feeding back intelligence to him about troop movements. By December of 1643, at Aston Hall, Sir Thomas Holt was getting very uneasy. He no doubt felt under threat from both Colonel Fox and the ardent parliamentarian supporters just down the road in Birmingham. So Sir Thomas sent to Colonel Levison at Dudley Castle for some military support, and 40 musketeers were sent to him on the 18th of December. Meanwhile, over in Coventry, the parliamentarian garrison learned what was going on. Colonel Godfrey Bosville was sent with 300 horse and foot with instructions to take Aston Hall. They spoilt Sir Thomas's Christmas dinner. They arrived on Christmas Day and called upon him to surrender. He refused. So they bombarded it with cannon. But this had little effect. So the following day, they stormed Aston Church, where a number of soldiers had been stationed. The soldiers in the house fought on, supported by Sir Thomas's servants, but the attackers reached the house and began to force their way in through the ground floor windows. A number of the defenders were killed or wounded before surrender was finally accepted. The house was thoroughly sacked. Sir Thomas Holt was taken into custody for a short time. It was recorded he was taken without a shirt to shift him. In other words, they hustled him off in whatever he was standing up in. Now, Sir Thomas Holt had been a lawyer, and he tried to talk himself out of trouble. He claimed that his house had been garrisoned without his consent, but nobody was going to believe that. And Sir Thomas's estates were sequestered or confiscated, and later he had to compound for them, which meant that he had to pay a large sum to get his property back again. Now, this was a policy employed on many occasions by both sides. By confiscating a man's estates, he had no resources with which to fight against you. And later on, when your war chest was getting empty, you filled it again by taking a large sum of money off him. In May 1644, Lord Denby's parliamentarian forces laid siege to Rushall Hall. The Royalists were ousted, and in September 1644, members of the King's forces tried to bribe the new parliamentarian commander at the hall. The commander, Captain Tuthill, was offered £2,000, an immense sum of money, by Francis Pitt, a yeoman farmer from Wensfield, to betray his men and surrender the hall to the king. Captain Tuthill was loyal. Francis Pitt was arrested and was executed in London. Lord Denby next laid siege to Dudley Castle, which was then under the command of Colonel John Beaumont of Wednesbury. Colonel Beaumont wrapped a letter around a piece of lead and dropped it down to the besiegers. It read this: "You are immediately to depart, you traitors and rebels, or tomorrow you shall be forced to leave your artillery behind you, and you shall have no quarter, for we are resolved to chastise you for your insolence." And the defenders then shouted down, "Yay, dogs! Give us an answer." They must have shut down quickly because the parliamentarians replied with cannonballs. And after a siege of 3 weeks, on June the 11th, a detachment of the King's forces arrived from Worcester. Lord Denby tried to pull his forces back to Stafford, and he sent some of them to engage the Royalists, resulting in a short and bitter skirmish between the opposing infantrymen on Tipton Green. The siege of the castle was abandoned. In October 1644, Royalist troops from Dudley Castle and Worcester tried to dislodge Colonel Fox with an attack on Edgbaston Hall, but they failed to do so. Then, in January 1645, when Colonel Fox and his troops were away from Edgbaston, Colonel Levison at Dudley Castle took advantage of this and sent a party of 400 foot and horse on a raiding party to Birmingham. From Dudley Castle, they were led by Sergeant Major Henningham. The Royalist troops surrounded the town centre, and then, according to an eyewitness report, they fell to plunder very cruelly for the space of 4 hours, insomuch that the poor women and children did make such a lamentable cry that they might have been heard half a mile off, crying, "Murder, murder!" Widow Greaves, a godly poor woman, they took all she had from her and turned her out in the street in her bare smock and bare-legged. And Widow Simmons' children were pulled out of their beds and their bedding and clothes taken from under them. And this was typical of what ordinary people were subjected to at intervals during the war. There was no moral high ground in this war. People were being robbed by pillaging soldiers from both sides. This one depicted here. It's been calculated that per head of population, more men died in this war than during the First World War. And these losses meant that farmland lay neglected, so harvests were reduced. Wars get paid for out of the pockets of the people. and punitive taxes were demanded of them by both sides to fund their campaigns. It didn't matter if your parish had paid the taxes to one side. If the collector for the other side turned up the following week, you had to pay again. In charge of collecting taxes and raising funds in Staffordshire was a man named Robert Wilmot. He was in the woolen cloth trade, lived in Smethwick. His family had a business on the River Stour near Kidderminster, and royalist troops had plundered his mills of all his stocks of cloth and stolen his horse, which left him ruined. "My children are left naked," he reported. So he was no doubt much relieved when he was given this important job by the parliamentarians. The accounts that Robert Wilmot kept survive. They've been analysed, and they reveal that, unfortunately, for such a responsible accounting job, he was not very good at arithmetic. One entry in his account books reads this: "By this account, there should be in my hand £54, 1 shilling and 4pence. The truth is, there is some mistake within the addition or some other way, for there is in my hand only £22, 11 shillings and no more. The rest is some way mistaken, and upon oath, I've not knowingly mistaken anything, nor taken benefit in any respect more than is before set down." Fortunately, the authorities accepted that his struggles to balance his books were honest. On the 14th of June, 1645, parliamentarian forces commanded by Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell engaged the royalists near the village of Naseby in Northamptonshire. And this time, the well-drilled and organised parliamentarians' new model army overcame the dash and vigour of Prince Rupert's cavalry. The royalists were comprehensively beaten. It was not the end of the conflict, but the tide of war was now unstoppably against the royalists. Following spring, parliamentarian Colonel Sir William Brereton laid siege to the royalist garrison in the Lichfield Cathedral Close and used cannon to blast away the central spire of the cathedral. Even when it fell, the royalists were determined to hold out, believing that the king was still in command of a large army, and not for several more weeks they finally realised how matters stood and negotiated terms for an honourable surrender. Meanwhile, back at Dudley, Colonel Levison decided that if the castle were attacked, the church of St Edmund, which stood immediately below Castle Hill, would provide cover to the enemy, and he ordered the church to be demolished. He did well to be apprehensive, because Sir William Brereton was ordered to take 3 regiments and lay siege to Dudley Castle. On the 27th of April, Sir William left Lichfield, but on the first night's camp at Walsall, the Shropshire Foot mutinied because they'd not been paid for a long time. Sir William pressed on without them and reached Dudley the next day. Now, hearing that the parliamentarians were on the way, Colonel Levison sent out his men on a foraging raid for supplies. Sir William's forces were met with the sight of a large herd of cattle being driven along Dudley High Street by the Royalists, who then abandoned the castle and made off back up into the castle, but not before setting fire to houses in the lower end of the High Street. And terrified by the firing of muskets, the cattle were stampeding in all directions. Sir William ordered his men to put out the fires, rounded up the cattle, allowed their owners to come in and reclaim them. And then Sir William rode off to Birmingham to pick up money to pay the soldiers' wages. The Shropshire Foot regiments suddenly realised that their only likelihood of ever seeing the wages due to them would be to rejoin the main party, and they set off for Dudley. They stopped off, according to Sir William Brereton's own account, at every tavern on the road. At Wednesbury, an innocent man was murdered by a group of drunken soldiers because he wouldn't tell them the way to the next tavern. And when the Shropshire Foot finally staggered into Dudley, they were sent off to guard the Priory. The Priory ruins stand below Castle Hill at Dudley. And some of them promptly lay down to sleep off the beer, and others sat down by the pool and went fishing. And those who managed to stay on their feet didn't even bother to prepare their muskets. Up at the castle, the Royalists spotted what was going on and charged down the hill to attack them. Within minutes, they'd overwhelmed the Shropshire Foot and taken them prisoner. But the commotion alerted the rest of the parliamentarians in the town. They galloped up and counterattacked. Once again, the Royalists retreated back behind the castle walls. Behind those walls, the Royalist second in command was Colonel John Beaumont. Remember, he wrote the letter, dropped it down? He was in a deeply distressing situation. His wife, Dorothy, who was with him at the castle and had given birth to a child there the previous September, she died. She couldn't be buried within the castle as there's no consecrated ground there. So Colonel Levison ordered the drummer to play the call to summon the parliamentarians for a parley. Colonel Levison ordered his drummer to play, and when the parley took place, fortunately, Sir William Brereton had returned from Birmingham with a back pay, and when this message about Mistress Beaumont reached him, he allowed her funeral cortege to pass through the parliamentarian lines and take her body to Dudley Top Church, St Thomas's. It couldn't be buried at the nearer church, St Edmunds, because St Edmunds had been destroyed. Well, by now things were looking well nigh hopeless for Colonel Levison. He and Sir William Brereton began negotiating terms for exchanging prisoners and surrendering the castle. And Mistress Beaumont having been laid to rest, at 1 p.m. on the 13th of May, 1646, 300 Royalist soldiers marched out of the castle and Sir William's troops took over. And a year later, Parliament decreed that Dudley Castle should be slighted, that is to say, defortified. While the residential buildings were left unharmed, the keep and the curtain wall were partially demolished, leaving those parts as the ruins that we see them today. You all know the eventual outcome of the war. King Charles was found guilty of making war on the people of his kingdom and was executed on the 30th of January, 1649. 11 years later, after the joyless Commonwealth rule of the puritanical parliamentarians. When the Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell died, the political system quickly fell apart so badly that the only way that loyalties could be pulled together again was to restore the monarchy, which took place on the 29th of May, 1660. By this time, most people were utterly weary of warfare and the incessant bickering of the various political factions. People were glad to welcome the restoration of King Charles II if it meant they could get on with their lives in peace. There are still faint echoes of that far-off conflict with us today. At Aston Hall, you can still see where a cannonball hit a stair post, resulting in damage which has never been repaired from that day to this. At Dudley Castle, the licensed premises are called the Grey Lady. There have long been sightings of the Grey Lady haunting the castle. It is said that this is Dorothy Beaumont. The story goes that the baby born in September 1645 died and was buried below the castle at the church of St. Edmund. And later, when Dorothy died, her body was interred at St. Thomas's top church because St. Edmund's had been demolished. They say that Dorothy's sad spirit wanders the castle seeking her lost babe, separated from her through all eternity, through the fortunes of war. It's a good story, and it features regularly in the ghost tours that are staged at Dudley Castle. I will mention that I have checked the contemporary burial registers. They do survive for both St. Thomas's and St. Edmund's in Dudley. I didn't find any entries in that period for anyone named Beaumont. But it is possible that Dorothy's burial went unrecorded because of the state of turmoil when her death took place. What is certain, though, is that this event gets commemorated in a race held at Dudley Pageant, when teams carrying coffins race each other from St. Edmund's Church to St. Thomas's Church and back again. And when that known supporter of Parliament, Thomas Parkes of Smethwick, died in 1669, his estate was worth the modern equivalent of about £400,000. That fortune eventually descended to his younger daughter, Dorothy Parkes. She bequeathed part of it to build a church, together with its vicarage and associated charity school, and provide a trust fund to finance them. This is still a parish church in Smethwick, and the Smethwick Old Church Trust funds still exist today. Money that can be traced back to those swords forged in Birmingham for the parliamentarian armies. So, whether your inclination is towards the wrong but a romantic side or the right but repulsive one, we in Smethwick do have reason to be thankful to those staunch forebears of ours who supplied that weaponry to the forces of Parliament and those who suffered considerably at the hands of the Royalists in consequence. There, ladies and gentlemen, you have my findings on what went on around here during the English Civil War. Thank you.
That was lovely. Thank you so much. That was brilliant. So a good start to our talk.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.